Celera sat in the cockpit of her Zarelian spacecraft, her sleek, slender fingers gliding over the control panel as the vast blue orb of Earth slowly came into view. The planet shimmered beneath her, clouds swirling over oceans and continents in a mesmerizing dance. Despite her years of training and preparation, her heart fluttered an odd sensation for a Zarelian, whose emotions were usually as muted as their advanced intellect. But something about this mission had stirred something in her, a curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. Her people, the Zarelians, had evolved far beyond the need for biological reproduction. Their society had mastered genetic engineering thousands of years ago, eliminating the randomness of natural birth. Children were designed with precision, cultivated in artificial incubators where every gene, every trait, was chosen for optimal advancement. The idea of allowing nature to dictate such important aspects of life was incomprehensible to them. But humans. They fascinated her. They still clung to what Zarelians would call primitive ways, relying on biology and emotional connection to bring forth new life. It was a strange paradox. Humanity's emotional intensity seemed to both hinder and drive them forward in equal measure. Celera had studied humans from afar for years. She understood their biology intimately, every hormone, every process involved in reproduction. But knowing wasn't enough. To truly understand, she needed to experience it herself. Her superiors had allowed her mission, intrigued by the idea that such a fundamental aspect of life could still have something to teach them. And now, she was about to land on Earth, ready to step into a world where reproduction wasn't just a scientific necessity, but a deeply personal, emotional experience. Her spacecraft descended smoothly into the atmosphere, gliding over vast stretches of land and sea, until she reached her destination, a remote location outside the bustling city where humanity's top researchers studied extraterrestrial life. As she landed, she felt a brief tremor of nerves. This mission was unlike any she had undertaken before. She was not here as a mere observer, but as a participant. The hatch of the ship slid open with a soft hiss, and Celera stepped out onto the Earth's surface. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of vegetation and moisture. She glanced around, her violet eyes scanning the unfamiliar landscape. Despite her vast knowledge of human culture, being here, physically on Earth, felt different. She was met by Dr. Nathaniel Jameson, a tall, slightly awkward man with messy brown hair and a sharp intellect. As head of the Earth Research Center's Extraterrestrial Studies Division, Nathaniel had been briefed about Celera's arrival. But what he didn't know was the true purpose of her visit. Celera, he greeted her with a warm smile, extending a hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." Celera took his hand, mimicking the human gesture she had observed countless times before. His skin was warm against hers, and she felt the pulse of his heartbeat, a strange, biological rhythm that was both alien and familiar. Zarelians had long since shed such physical markers of life, yet here it was, beating within him, connecting him to the world around him. "The honor is mine, Dr. Jameson," she replied smoothly, her voice calm and melodic. "I've heard much about your work. I'm eager to collaborate." Nathaniel gestured toward a sleek research vehicle waiting for them. "Shall we? We've prepared accommodations for you at the center. I'm sure you'll find them to your liking." Celera nodded, following him into the vehicle. As they sped toward the research center, Nathaniel filled the silence with small talk, discussing the latest advancements in human technology and their growing understanding of the universe. Celera listened politely, her mind already racing ahead to the task at hand. This was all background noise to her true mission. As they arrived at the Earth Research Center, a sprawling complex nestled in the mountains, Nathaniel led Celera through its sterile halls. The building was filled with cutting-edge technology, sleek white walls lined with screens displaying information about space, alien life, and the various projects humans were currently engaged in. But what interested Celera the most wasn't the technology, it was the people. As they passed through the halls, she watched the scientists and staff interact. There was a warmth to their exchanges, a fluidity in the way they connected with one another. hands brushing against arms, smiles shared across rooms, the subtle dance of body language that spoke of bonds far deeper than simple cooperation. These were the elements of human life she had come to study, the invisible threads that tied them together: emotions, affection, and intimacy. Finally, Nathaniel led her to a private suite designed specifically for extraterrestrial guests. "This will be your home during your stay," he said, motioning around the room. It was minimalist, with sleek lines and soft lighting, the furniture designed for comfort while also accommodating different species' needs. "If there's anything you require, just let me know." "Thank you, Dr. Jameson," Celera said, her tone formal, though inside she was already calculating her next steps. "I'm curious," Nathaniel said, his voice lowering slightly as though venturing into more personal territory. "What exactly are you hoping to gain from your time here? I know your people are far more advanced than we are. It's rare for an emissary to visit Earth without a specific agenda." Celera hesitated for a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her otherwise composed expression. She could tell him the truth that she was here to study humanity's most intimate practice, reproduction, by partaking in it herself. But that was a conversation for another time. For now, she needed to ease into the subject. "I am here to learn, Dr. Jameson," she said, her voice carefully measured. "There are aspects of your species of human life that are unique, things that can only be understood by experiencing them directly. This is not simply a scientific mission for me. It is a personal one." Nathaniel looked intrigued but didn't press further. "Well, I hope you find what you're looking for. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." As Nathaniel left her alone in the room, Celera sat down on the soft couch, her mind swirling with thoughts. The mission had officially begun. Soon, she would delve into the heart of human intimacy, a journey into the unknown. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her decision settle over her. The first step was complete. Now, the true expo. The sun had begun to set over the research center, casting a golden hue across the mountains surrounding the facility. Inside her private quarters, Celera stood by the large window, her violet eyes watching the horizon. The colors of the Earth's sky at dusk were mesmerizing, shifting pinks, purples, and golds, blending together in a way that no artificial environment on Zar-Elis could replicate. The beauty of it tugged at something inside her, a sensation she found increasingly difficult to suppress since arriving. Her mission had become more complex than she initially thought. It wasn't just about understanding human reproduction anymore. She had begun to feel drawn to humanity itself, and in particular, to Dr. Nathaniel Jameson. Nathaniel had been kind, professional, and curious, like all the scientists Celera had encountered during her stay. But there was something else about him, a warmth, an openness that transcended the data and facts he often spoke of. The more time she spent with him, the more she became aware of how different human interactions were from those of her own people. Zar-Elians communicated logically and efficiently, with little need for the emotional entanglements humans seemed to indulge in. And yet, the emotional dimension of human life fascinated her in a way she hadn't anticipated. That evening, Nathaniel invited Celera to join him for a casual dinner, a concept that was still somewhat strange to her. Zar-Elians did not eat in a social sense. Sustenance was taken in through engineered nutrients that required no taste, no ritual. But humans? They ate for pleasure, for connection, for the simple joy of sharing a moment with another. She had observed it many times, but tonight would be different. She would participate. The dining hall was small but elegant, with soft lighting and a large window that looked out onto the darkening mountains. Nathaniel had arranged for a simple meal: salads, bread, and some grilled vegetables, aware that her alien physiology might not process their food in the same way. Still, he wanted the evening to feel normal, like two colleagues sharing a quiet moment after a long day of work. "I wasn't sure what you might enjoy," Nathaniel said, offering her a seat. "But I figured something light and simple would be safe." Celera sat down gracefully, her movements always precise, controlled. This is more than adequate, she said, offering a faint smile. I appreciate the consideration. As they began to eat, Nathaniel tried to engage her in casual conversation, asking her more about her life on Zar Ellis, how her society functioned, and what she found most surprising about Earth. Celera answered him with the same calm precision she always did, but internally, she was preoccupied with something else entirely. She had been preparing for this moment for days ever since her fascination with human reproduction had turned into a personal quest. Tonight, she would make her intentions clear. Nathaniel, she said after a brief pause in their conversation, I have been observing human behavior closely since I arrived here. Your methods of interaction, your customs, your emotions. It's all very different from what I know. Nathaniel nodded, not quite sure where this was going. I suppose we do things a bit differently than other species you've encountered. Yes. One thing in particular has captured my attention, Celera continued, her gaze steady on his. Your species reproduces through a process that, for humans, goes beyond mere biology. It is intertwined with emotions, with connection. It's not something Zarelians practice. For us, reproduction is a clinical, engineered process. But for you. She paused, searching for the right words. It seems to be something much deeper. Nathaniel blinked, feeling his pulse quicken. He had studied alien biology for years, but this was a topic he hadn't expected to come up, certainly not during a casual dinner. I suppose it is, he said slowly, unsure where she was leading. Celera leaned forward slightly, her eyes intent on his. I wish to experience it. There was a long, heavy silence as Nathaniel processed her words. His fork clattered softly against the plate as he set it down. Experience. What, exactly? The human reproductive process, Celera replied matter-of-factly, though her voice carried a subtle undercurrent of curiosity. I wish to understand it firsthand, not just in terms of biology, but in its entirety. The connection, the emotions, the bond that humans seem to form through it. Nathaniel felt his heart skip a beat. He stared at her, trying to gauge if she was serious. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Wait, you're saying. You want to dash, he stopped himself, unsure of how to even finish the sentence. Celera nodded, her expression unchanging, though there was a spark of something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. Yes. I believe this process will provide me with invaluable insight into human nature. I have studied the biological aspects, but I need to understand the experience itself. And for that, I require a human partner. Nathaniel's mind raced. This was completely unprecedented. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined an alien emissary proposing something like this. He had always thought of Celera as this cold, intellectual being, so far removed from the messiness of human life. But here she was, asking him to help her experience the most intimate aspect of humanity. I don't know what to say, he stammered. This is a lot. Celera tilted her head slightly, studying him. Is it such a strange request? Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. I mean, yes. It's not something that's done casually. For humans, this kind of thing sits deeply personal. It's not just about reproduction for us. There's emotion involved. That is precisely what interests me, Celera said softly. I wish to understand those emotions. I want to feel what humans feel. Nathaniel was at a loss. He couldn't deny that the idea intrigued him on a purely intellectual level. What scientist wouldn't be fascinated by the chance to see how a being from another world would experience human intimacy? But this wasn't just an experiment, it was deeply personal, for both of them. And despite her calm demeanor, he sensed that Celera was more invested in this than she was letting on. Celera, this isn't just science, Nathaniel said carefully. For humans, sex can create a connection between people. It's not something you can just switch off after it's done. Are you sure you want to do this? You might experience feelings you're not prepared for. Solar's violet eyes met his, and for the first time since they had met, Nathaniel saw something in her that was almost vulnerable. I understand the risks, she said quietly. But I am willing to accept them. I want to experience the full range of human existence, Nathaniel. I want to know what it means to truly connect. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, the weight of her request settling over him like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about science. This was about something much deeper, something that could change them both forever. I need some time to think about this, he said finally, his voice strained. This is not something to take lightly. Celera nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. Take all the time you need. I do not wish to pressure you. I merely wanted to make my intentions clear. As the evening drew to a close, Nathaniel found himself lost in thought. What Celera was asking of him was monumental, not just scientifically but personally. He had always considered himself a man of logic, someone who approached everything with a rational mind. But this was something else entirely. He watched her leave the dining hall, her graceful form disappearing down the corridor, and wondered if he could truly help her understand what it meant to be human when he wasn't sure he fully understood it himself. The following days passed in a blur of contemplation for both Celera and Nathaniel. The weight of Solara's proposal lingered in the air, thick with tension and curiosity. Nathaniel had avoided the subject for as long as possible, immersing himself in his work and spending long hours in the lab. But the question kept creeping back into his mind, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Could he really go through with it? Not just for the sake of science, but for Solar, the alien emissary who had come to understand humanity in a way that went far beyond mere data collection. Celera, on the other hand, spent her time preparing meticulously for the experiment, as was the Zarelian way. Her kind approached every situation with precision and logic, so she had immersed herself in studying every possible variable of human reproduction. She read medical journals, watched documentaries, and reviewed cultural studies on the concept of intimacy. But no matter how much knowledge she accumulated, there was one element she couldn't grasp: the emotional depth that humans brought to the process. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, Celera sought out Nathaniel in the research center's greenhouse, a quiet, secluded space where he often retreated when he needed to think. She found him there, sitting on a bench surrounded by lush greenery and the soft hum of machinery maintaining the artificial ecosystem. Nathaniel, Solara's voice broke the peaceful silence, drawing his attention. He looked up, meeting her violet gaze, a mixture of tension and something unspoken in his eyes. Celera, he responded quietly. I've been thinking about what you asked. She stepped closer, her presence somehow both calming and unsettling at the same time. And what have you decided? She asked, her tone neutral but carrying the weight of her anticipation. Nathaniel took a deep breath. I'm not going to lie, Celera. This isn't something I ever expected to be asked. And honestly, I'm still not sure how I feel about it. It's not just about reproduction for humans, it's personal, it's intimate. I don't think I've ever seen sex as a scientific experiment. Celera remained still, listening intently, but her expression softened slightly. I understand that this is a significant request. But for me, this is more than an experiment. I'm not seeking to reduce the act to mere biology. I want to understand the emotional, psychological, and even spiritual components of what humans experience during reproduction. Nathaniel's brow furrowed as he considered her words. It wasn't the first time he'd heard her speak with such clarity, but something about this moment made it feel different, more human. I just don't know if I can approach it like that, he said. I'm a scientist, but I'm also a person. And this is deeply personal. For a moment, they stood in silence, the faint sound of trickling water from a nearby fountain the only noise in the room. Solara's gaze never left his, and then, after a pause that felt eternal, she spoke again, her voice quieter, more vulnerable than Nathaniel had ever heard. "That is why I asked you," she admitted. "You are a person. A human. I don't just want to understand the science behind this act. I want to experience it as you do, with all the emotions and connections it entails. I believe there is something about this process that can only be understood by feeling it." Nathaniel felt his heart tighten. It was easy to forget, looking at Solara's calm, ethereal presence, that she had never experienced human emotions like love, affection, or desire. To her, this wasn't about crossing a professional boundary, it was about understanding an entirely new dimension of life. Finally, Nathaniel stood up from the bench, meeting Solara's gaze directly. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty coursing through him. "But if we do this, it has to be on both of our terms. We'll approach it with care. This isn't just a scientific experiment, it's going to be real. Do you understand that?" Solara nodded, her expression shifting from determination to a softer, more thoughtful look. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I agree." 2 nights later, they stood in Solara's quarters, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. The sterile, minimalist design of the room felt stark against the intimacy of what was about to happen, but neither of them acknowledged the discomfort. They had both prepared, mentally and emotionally, but now that the moment was here, everything felt surreal. Solara had taken extra care to study human customs regarding intimacy, how touch was often used to express affection, how certain rituals, like soft lighting or calming sounds, created an environment conducive to connection. She had arranged for her room to have these elements, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow, and quiet, soothing music playing in the background. It was a gesture she made to respect human culture, but it also created an atmosphere that felt more personal. Nathaniel was nervous, that much was clear. He moved carefully, like someone trying not to disturb a delicate situation, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Solara. She stood before him, a serene presence as always, but there was something new in her expression and openness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah. I think so." Solara stepped closer to him, her movements slow and deliberate. She had read about the importance of physical touch in human intimacy, how skin-to-skin contact could foster a sense of closeness. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his before finally resting gently against his palm. Her skin was cool to the touch, but the sensation sent a jolt of electricity through Nathaniel's body. As their hands touched, Solara felt a sudden wave of something unfamiliar, something that wasn't purely physical. It was a spark, a connection she couldn't quantify. Her Zarelian mind struggled to process it, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to feel it, to lean into the experience in a way that was utterly foreign to her. Nathaniel, too, felt the shift in the air between them. The awkwardness he had expected began to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of curiosity about Solara, about this moment, and about what it meant to share something so profound with someone from another world. He gently squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin in a gesture of reassurance. Their proximity grew, the space between them shrinking until there was nothing left but the quiet, steady rhythm of their breathing. Nathaniel reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, and he was surprised by how natural it felt. Solara's gaze softened, and for the first time, Nathaniel saw something distinctly human in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, a longing to understand. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle meeting of two worlds. Solara remained still, her body processing the sensation. Her mind buzzed with data, the texture of his lips, the warmth of his skin, the softness of the moment. But beneath the data, something else stirred, a quiet hum of emotion that she couldn't quite define. It wasn't just the act of kissing. It was the connection, the shared experience. Nathaniel pulled back slightly, searching her face for any sign of discomfort, but what he found was something unexpected. Solara's eyes, once cool and analytical, were now wide with wonder. "I felt something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand it, but I felt something." "That's the connection," Nathaniel said softly, his hand still resting on her cheek. "That's what humans feel." Solara nodded slowly, processing his words. "It's overwhelming." Nathaniel smiled gently. "It can be. But we don't have to rush. We can take our time." Solara's eyes softened, and for the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to let go of the strict control she had always maintained. She leaned into the moment, into the connection, and allowed herself to experience what it meant to be truly human. Hours later, they lay together in the soft light, their bodies entwined in the quiet aftermath of the most profound experience of Solara's life. She felt different, changed in a way she couldn't fully explain. The sensation of closeness, of sharing something intimate with another being, had opened a door in her mind that she hadn't even known existed. Nathaniel lay beside her, his breathing steady, his hand resting lightly on her arm. He, too, felt the weight of what had just happened, but it wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the connection they had forged, a bridge between two worlds. "Are you okay?" Nathaniel asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. Solara turned to face him, her violet eyes shimmering in the dim light. "Yes," she replied softly. "I am more than okay. I understand now." "What do you mean?" he asked. "I understand what it means to be human," she said, her voice filled with awe. "To connect, to feel. It is not something that can be described or studied. It must be experienced." Nathaniel smiled gently, his fingers tracing a line along her arm. "That's exactly right." As they lay together, the quiet hum of the research center in the background, Solara knew that her mission had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. She had come to Earth to learn about reproduction, but what she had found was far more profound. She had found connection. Morning sunlight filtered through the window of Solara's quarters, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. The air was calm, still, and the silence between Solara and Nathaniel felt almost sacred. They lay beside each other, their bodies still entwined, the weight of the night's events heavy but not oppressive. For a long time, neither spoke. Nathaniel could feel the slow rise and fall of Solara's breathing, her presence next to him a comforting but surreal reminder of what they had shared. He wasn't sure how to process it, this mix of science, intimacy, and something far more profound. It wasn't just an experiment anymore. It had become deeply personal, and the impact of that was beginning to settle in. Solara, too, was lost in thought. She had spent her life in the pursuit of knowledge, but this was a different kind of understanding. The emotions swirling inside her were complex and unfamiliar, and despite all her studies, there was no algorithm, no calculation that could explain what she was feeling. She had expected to learn something about human reproduction, but instead, she had learned something about herself. She had felt connection. True, unfiltered connection. Nathaniel stirred beside her, his voice breaking the quiet. "How do you feel?" Solara turned to him, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to find the right words to express what she was feeling. "It is difficult to explain," she said slowly. "I feel different. Changed, in a way I did not expect." Nathaniel nodded, understanding the complexity of her emotions. "I get that. It's not something you can really prepare for, no matter how much you study it." Solara sat up slowly, pulling the sheet around her as she gazed out the window. The landscape beyond was bathed in early morning light, the mountains standing tall against the sky. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her skin, and it was almost as if her senses had been heightened overnight. The world felt more vivid, more alive than ever before. "I came here to study reproduction as a biological function," she began, her voice thoughtful. "But what I experienced was not just biology. It was. She paused, struggling to find the right word. It was connection, as you said. An emotional bond that goes beyond the act itself. Nathaniel sat up beside her, watching her closely. That's what I was trying to explain before. For humans, sex is more than just reproduction. It's about trust, vulnerability, and sharing a part of yourself with someone else. Celera nodded, her gaze distant as she processed his words. On Zar-Elis, we have long separated emotion from function. Reproduction is a clinical, calculated process, and emotions are considered unnecessary distractions. But now, I wonder if we have lost something in doing that. There is a depth to this experience that cannot be measured or replicated in a lab. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. Do you regret it? Celera turned to him, her expression softening. No, she said, her voice firm. I do not regret it. In fact, I believe this may be one of the most important discoveries of my life. Nathaniel exhaled, relief flooding through him. He hadn't been sure how Celera would react after the night they shared. He knew she approached things with a clinical mind, but the way she was speaking now, it was clear that something had shifted inside her. Celera, Nathaniel began, his voice quiet but filled with emotion, this wasn't just an experiment for me either. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I didn't think it would affect me this much. She regarded him carefully, sensing the complexity of his emotions. You have been changed as well, she observed, her tone more empathetic than analytical. He nodded, looking down at his hands. Yeah. I have. I never thought I'd feel this way. I mean, you're from a completely different world, and yet we connected. On a level I didn't think was possible. Celera smiled faintly, a gesture that was still rare for her, but one that had become more natural in Nathaniel's presence. Perhaps our differences are not as vast as we once believed, she mused. Connection, it seems, transcends species. Nathaniel laughed softly, the sound light but filled with understanding. I guess so. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, both of them absorbing the enormity of what had transpired. The night before had been a turning point for both of them, not just as individuals but as representatives of their species. The implications were profound not just personally but on a larger scale. What they had shared was more than just a moment between two beings. It was the beginning of something that could bridge worlds. Finally, Celera broke the silence, her tone more serious now. I must report my findings to Zar-Elis. Nathaniel stiffened slightly, the reality of their situation crashing back into him. He had almost forgotten, for a brief moment, that Celera was here on a mission. That she wasn't just someone he had shared an intimate connection with, she was an emissary from another world, with responsibilities and obligations that went far beyond Earth. What will you tell them? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. I will tell them the truth, Celera replied. That the human reproductive process is more than just biology. That it involves emotional connection, intimacy, and vulnerability elements that are absent from our own practices. And I will tell them that this emotional dimension is not a weakness, as we have always believed, but a strength. Nathaniel felt a flicker of hope at her words. Do you think they'll understand? I do not know, Celera admitted. My people value logic and efficiency above all else. They may dismiss my findings as irrelevant, or they may see them as an opportunity for further study. But I cannot predict how they will respond. Nathaniel reached out, taking her hand in his. And what about you? How do you feel about going back? Celera looked down at their joined hands, her expression thoughtful. I have always known my place in the universe, she said quietly. But now, I feel as though I am standing on the edge of something new. Something unknown. Nathaniel's thumb gently brushed over her skin. You don't have to go back right away, you know. You could stay a little longer. Explore this. Connection. Celera hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. I am bound by duty to return to Zarellis, she said softly. But part of me wishes to stay. To understand more of what I have felt. Of what we have shared. Nathaniel's heart ached at her words. He had known from the beginning that this moment would come, that Solaris' time on Earth was limited. But now, with the possibility of her departure looming over them, he felt a deep sense of loss. What they had experienced was unique, something that transcended not only the boundaries of their species, but the boundaries of logic itself. You're not just an emissary to me, Celera, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. You're someone I've come to care about. Celera met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and sorrow. And you are someone I care about as well, Nathaniel. More than I ever expected to. They sat in silence, the enormity of their situation sinking in. They were from two different worlds literally, and yet they had found something in each other that defied explanation. But duty and distance would soon separate them, and the reality of that was almost too painful to bear. Finally, Celera stood, her posture graceful but her expression heavy with emotion. I will return to Zarellis, she said softly, but I will take this experience with me. It will remain a part of who I am, always. Nathaniel rose to stand beside her, his heart heavy. I'll never forget this, he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. I'll never forget you. Celera leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against his, a gesture she had learned from observing humans, a symbol of closeness, of connection. Nor will I forget you, she whispered. With one last lingering glance, Celera turned and left the room, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the soft morning light. As Solaris' ship ascended into the atmosphere, leaving Earth behind, she sat in the cockpit, her thoughts swirling with the weight of what had transpired. She had come to Earth as an emissary, a scientist seeking to understand human reproduction. But she was leaving with so much more, with knowledge, with connection, and with a part of her that would never be the same. The stars stretched out before her, an endless expanse of space. But now, for the first time, that vastness didn't feel so empty. Celera smiled to herself, a small, quiet smile filled with the kind of emotion she had once thought impossible. For she had learned what it truly meant to be human.